Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today's video is the April reading wrap-up, and I was participating in two readathons, the linguathon and the mythothon, and I did okay with both as far as completing the prompts and challenges, but I wouldn't say that I did spectacularly, and that's kind of how I feel about the entire month for my reading journey. This month I read 8 books compared to the 14 books that I read in March, which was like never gonna happen again. I knew that, but still, this is about half the books. And also I had quite a few 3-star reads in this batch, which you will soon see, so not necessarily a lot of books to add to my quarterly bookish brackets or necessarily favorite books of all time, although there were some bright points in the month and you'll see those as well. But why don't we just dive right in? The first book that I want to talk about is The German Girl by Armando Correa, and it is World War II historical fiction with dual plot lines. So one of the plot lines follows Hannah, who is a young German girl living in Berlin during Nazi persecution, and she and her family managed to escape aboard the St. Louis and travel to Cuba. And then the other plotline follows Anna, who is her grandniece and is this young girl living in New York City in like 2014, 2015, and she doesn't know much about her father's family because he's disappeared, and Hannah reaches out to her, sending her all this memorabilia from her time aboard the St. Louis, and when the story finally converges, it's because Anna goes to meet Hannah in Cuba. And so it really is sort of this family history story told through the perspectives of largely these two 11 or 12-year-old girls. I ended up giving this 3 stars because it was just okay to me. It was really nothing to write home about. The dual plot lines had so much parallelism that you could almost deduce what was going to happen based on sections that you'd already read previously. And for me, I don't like knowing what's going to happen, and so that kind of bugged me because in addition to that, I also figured out or knew exactly how this book was going to end, probably by reading to like 50% in. Like, I just knew what was coming, and that's not the sort of reading experience I particularly enjoy. Some people really enjoy trying to guess and figure out what's going to happen. That's not me. And then also, one of the things that really bothered me is that for the most part you're in the heads of these young girls who are 11 or 12 years old, and their voices just seemed very, very young for that age group. And I might be giving 11 or 12-year-old me more credit than she's due, but emotionally they just felt much more immature than that age group that we were meant to believe they were in. And so that just kind of was a little niggling thing that distracted from the overall reading. I did, as I mentioned, give it 3 stars because there were more moments in this book where I was genuinely moved and might have shed a tear or two and really connected with the characters. But overall, I was just kind of like, meh, read it, and on to the next, you know? Like, that's just how I felt. The next book is Detransition Baby by Torrey, and this was recommended to me by my friend Liz, and I honestly love when Liz gives me recommendations because it pushes me out of my comfort zone, makes me read genres that I might not be drawn to by myself, and that was certainly the case here. Like, this is not a book that I would have necessarily reached for because, first of all, it's hyped, and as I've said many times on this channel, I am allergic to hype. And also it's contemporary fiction, which is not generally a genre that I read. However, this was so fascinating, so raw, and well worth the hype, okay? Like, Liz told me to read this book back in January, and I immediately went to the Libby app, and it took nearly 4 months for that waiting list to finally get to me so that I could read it. Like, that's how hyped and how eager people are to read this book right now. And I've actually seen people post on their Instagram stories that like they can't find the book in bookstores. So it's blown up with reason. It is an own voice story. Torrey Peters is a trans woman, and the story itself really focuses on three main characters. There's Reese, who is a trans woman who wants to experience motherhood, but is kind of going about that mission or that quest in self-destructive ways. There is Ames, who has detransitioned from being a woman by the start of the book and is now living as a man, but when Ames was Amy, she and Reese had been an item. And then there is Katrina, the cis woman who Ames has been sleeping with and ends up getting knocked up. And so the book really revolves around these three individuals and this attempt for them to figure out a way to kind of co-parent on their own terms. It is a book that really explores gender and sexuality and what motherhood means, and it's really raw and just amazing. I had such a good time with this. I will say that the characters aren't necessarily the most likable characters in the world. Like, Ames to me is a complete bonehead, and a lot of the decisions that he makes I want to just like upside the head, because I'm just like, why did you ever think that was a good idea? And throughout the book you kind of feel that way about all three of the characters, but you could also really sympathize with characters when you have these flashbacks of Amy. I just felt so sorry for her as a character, and there's this moment where they're talking about the fact that trans women don't necessarily have an older generation to look up to, so they don't necessarily know how to act or what they're doing or have that sort of support system that they can turn to for advice. And my heart just broke because it was such a beautiful like section, and it was just wow. If you've read this book, I think you will know exactly the section I'm talking about, but it really did make me think. The only reason I didn't give it 5 stars, I ended up giving it 4 stars, was because there were moments, especially with Reese as a character, that not necessarily that it felt preachy, but kinda in the same way. Like, sometimes, especially towards the end of the book, it did feel like she would stand on a soapbox, and it pulled me out of the story at those moments, and so I would have appreciated a little bit less of that, especially towards the end. But overall, it was a phenomenal read. I would recommend that you get a copy of it yourself, because this was just phenomenal, and there needs to be more transgender fiction out there, and so this was a really great one to read. The next book is Dragonfly Amber by Gabaldon, and I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail with this one because I actually have a very spoilery reading vlog of my entire like 1,000-page journey through this one, which I'll link for you if you want to check it out. But this is book 2 in the Outlander series, and I am currently trying to read through the 8 published books in time to read number 9 when it comes out in November. So this is, did I say this is book 2 in the series, and Jamie and Claire are effectively trying to change history by thwarting the Jacobite Rebellion, because the Jacobite Rebellion ends up causing this extreme loss of life and really changes the Highlander way of life completely. So they're on a mission to stop that from happening. The book is bookended by Claire being in the 1960s, so you know at the beginning of the book that she's traveled back to her own time, and it ends during that time as well, but she is really about to tell, and does eventually tell, her daughter Brianna that her father is Jamie, and so you have those two storylines effectively in this book, but the lion's share of it is set in the past with Jamie and Claire in France and then eventually in Scotland. I ended up giving this a 4.5 star rating because it does have everything that I love about Outlander, which was one of my favorite books of all time. You have the relationship between Jamie and Claire, you have the steam bordering on smutty at times, you have the history, which I am obsessed with, but for me it just wasn't necessarily a 5-star rating because there were sort of some supporting characters, I guess, or secondary characters that felt a little bit flat here. Like, I would have loved them to be a little bit more developed than they were, but they just really felt like props in some instances. I'm hoping that as the series goes along, characters like Fergus will get their time to shine, and I do feel like he started to towards the end of the book, but there were just a few moments of that happened, but otherwise I ugly sobbed my way through the end of this book, which I expected. I knew how it was going to end, and still it hit me in the feels. So yeah, this was a 4.5 read for me. Next is Tea and Sympathy by Robert Anderson, which is a play, and this is actually a reread for me. I felt the urge to watch the movie earlier this month, which is what inspired my book to movie adaptations video that I will also link for you. But after I watched it, I was like, you know, it's been years since I read that play. Why don't I pick it up? So that's what I did. This ended up being a 4-star read for me. It is a play and a story that I've always really enjoyed. I will say that it is very dated. Like, this is very much a time capsule of a particular point in American history and American culture. Keep that in mind. It's not something that I would say necessarily ages all of that well. Like, part of me was like, how would they actually put on a production of this today? That is the question that I keep asking myself. But it is the story of this young man at a boarding school in New England, I think, and he is hazed mercilessly by his peers and his male teachers, who all believe or suspect that he might be gay because of something that happens at the beginning of this book. And the rumor mill churns, and his peers and his teachers are ruthless in how they think that he's not a quote-unquote regular guy. And it's really this story of toxic masculinity and bullying, and it's just heartbreaking to see this character going through this, because as a reader, you know that not only is the bullying unfair just because it is bullying, you also know that it has no basis, and you also know that it's just categorically untrue for this character, because he is in love with his teacher's wife, who is slightly older. I think she's in her 20s in this, and he is like puppy love supreme with this teacher. And she also happens to be the only character in the book who really takes care of him and is concerned about him and doesn't look at his sensitivity or his interests or any of that as a sign that he is weak or any less masculine than his peers. And it's a heartbreaking story in a lot of ways. There's also some triggering content. The relationship between the young man and his teacher's wife is problematic and probably icky because of the age difference, so bear that in mind. But as far as being a piece of American stage history, I do think it's a really interesting story, especially because although the story and some of the dialogue is very, like, dated, as I mentioned, this conversation about toxic masculinity and bullying and hazing and all of that still feels very timely. So the themes it addresses still make sense, even if some of the characters and the interactions do not. But as I said, this was a 4-star read for me. The next book is Abigail by Magda Szabo, which was a book that I read for the linguathon because it is translated from Hungarian, and this is actually the second book that I've read by Magda Szabo, and oh my word, I finished this book and quickly snatched up a third book of hers during the indie bookstore day, like, frenzy, because I'm hooked. Like, so hooked. I think she might actually be a contender for one of my favorite authors of all time, because her writing to me, her stories are just, like, so flawless. The characters and their psychology so complex, and it's just wow. So this is a YA novel and also historical fiction, which I believe was written in the 1970s, but it's set during World War II. The main character, Gina, is this young girl who is sent by her father to this boarding school during the war, and Gina and the boarding school don't always see eye to eye. Gina is a bit of a problem. She is stubborn, she is impulsive, somewhat hot-headed, and spoiled, and this is an institution that is very religious and very strict, and basically the polar opposite of how she has been raised up to this point. And when I was reading it, I expected it to be a lot of, like, boarding school girl hijinks, and to a degree it is. Like, these are teenage girls, and they are doing teenage girl things. Like, they are young and are fall hook, line, and sinker for the romanticism of, like, the idea of marriage, and they play games that are akin to, like, 1940s versions of, like, MASH or MASH Up, which you might have played in middle school. And there's just, like, a lot of hijinks that you would expect of this age group, and they have their traditions and their lore, one of which is the statue of Abigail from the title, which basically there's a statue on the ground, and they say that if you're in desperate need of help, if you leave Abigail a note, she will help you. And so that's one of their traditions and legends that the school is obsessed with. But when this book takes on, like, history, and it's looking at this tenuous sort of alliance between the Hungarians and the Germans during World War II and resistance within the country, it was like chef's kiss for me. That's the sort of thing that I live for. I love that that complexity was added to this story, so that for me it just wasn't about characters at a boarding school, it was about this bigger picture, and I absolutely loved it. Like, I could not put this down. It was so good. I was so upset when it finished because I just wanted to continue living on through the story. Also, trying to figure out who Abigail was during this whole book was just amazing, because I kept changing my mind on who it was, and it was just such a lovely surprise at the end. This book is so beautifully written in English. Every little orange tab here is me marking a piece of, like, the text that I just thought was stunning. And if it is that beautiful in English, I can only imagine what it would be like in its original text in Hungarian. I completely understand why this is one of Magda Szabo's most beloved books in Hungary, and part of me is really sad that I don't know Hungarian, so I can't read it in its original text, because things are always lost in translation, but if it's still able to be as beautiful as it was, I feel like I'm missing out here. But it was phenomenal. This was a 5-star read for me, and yeah, it was not what I expect of a YA novel at all. And I don't know if that's because, like, it probably wasn't written to be YA in the 1970s. I don't even know if that was a genre back then, but it was just beautiful. Okay, guys? So if you're looking for more women in translation, I would highly recommend it. So at the start of this, I said that it was kind of a mixed bag of a month, and that I had a lot of, like, meh reads, and then I proceeded to tell you about like 4 books that were 4 stars or higher, so maybe it wasn't as bad of a reading month as I had said, and maybe I'm only thinking that way because the books that I ended up reading at the end of the month, the ones that are most fresh in my mind, are the ones that were kind of misses for me, so those are the books we're gonna start talking about now. And the first one, which was a real miss for me, was Hijab Red Lipstick by Yousra Imran. And this was a book that I was actually reading for my work book club, and to be honest, if I hadn't been reading it for that book club, if I hadn't been the one that was supposed to lead the conversation for that book club, I probably would have DNF'd this. I really did not enjoy this book at all. It's also really hard to get a hold of in the US, which I didn't know when it was picked for the book club, so it seems like it's only printed in the UK, and you're only able to get it as an ebook in the US unless you order from the UK. But yeah, no, I really hoped I would like this because I think there was a lot of potential here. So the book is about this British Muslim teenager, Sarah, whose family ends up moving to the Arabian Gulf, and while there, her father, who was already pretty strict to begin with, becomes increasingly more strict and conservative because of the people and the culture and the society in which they are now living, and Sarah has to deal with a very patriarchal society and this guardianship system where you as a woman are answerable for your behavior to your father and then your husband. She really struggles with this society and the way that things are, and it had potential to do so much in my opinion, and there were parts of it that I enjoyed. I enjoyed that I was learning a bit more about the Islamic religion through this book, and that the author wasn't treating me like I was a dummy where everything had to be explained. It was inferred that I could figure it out based on what I had previously read, and if I was still clueless, there was a glossary at the back of the book, or I could, you know, Google it. So I did appreciate that, but this book, the characters were so flat to me, so one-dimensional, that it was a book, as I said, I would have DNF'd. Like, there was just no complexity or nuance to the characters. For the most part, the characters fell into either the category of being a perpetrator or a victim, and if they were a perpetrator, you were meant to think of them as evil and antagonistic and nothing else, and if they were the victim, you were meant to think of them as good and naive and just feel sorry for them. And I like complex characters, and this was not that. Like, as I said, they were very flat, very one-dimensional, to the point that I felt like they were caricatures almost. Like, it just wasn't great for me. And also, I just feel like there was so much that this book could have addressed potentially, and it did feel a little bit superficial to me, because really the majority of the book is talking about Sarah wanting to date and sort of her misadventures trying to date in this society where you're not meant to date, and just about men and boys, or is about her wanting to wear like lipstick and makeup and that sort of thing. And I feel like there was just so much more that could have been explored. And on top of that, this was a book that I would say has very triggering content, and they do actually have a line on the back, warning, deals with sensitive issues that some may find triggering, which is the first time I've actually seen that on a book. But it got to a point with some of it that I was wondering how much of it was necessary. Like, after a point it was like, was I gaining more from having seen 2 characters experience this? Or was it just overkill? Or, on the other side of it, if I'm playing devil's advocate with myself, was it trying to explain that this was more rampant in this society than I would have anticipated? I don't know. But as far as the characters being the way they were, I just really didn't enjoy this. I ended up giving this 2.5 stars because I wasn't bored reading it, which is how I felt with Addie LaRue, which is why that was a 2-star read for me. This book I probably wasn't the right audience for to begin with, and that's okay, but it just wasn't a great reading experience for me. I'll leave it at that. The next book is The Lady Elizabeth by Alison Weir, and as you can see, I do have a physical copy of the book, but ultimately I listened to this as an audiobook more so than I did read the physical book, and I was really excited about this because Alison Weir in the historical fiction space is well known, and I've read her nonfiction and really enjoyed it when I did years ago. So I had high expectations, and unfortunately this book did not meet them, is the politest way to say it. This is the story of Queen Elizabeth before she begins her reign. So it starts when Elizabeth is like 2-3 years old, around the time that her mother Anne Boleyn is beheaded, and follows her through childhood, adolescence, and finally to the point when she becomes Queen of England. As far as the historical elements of this book goes, I do think that it was interesting because it feels as though it covers a span in Tudor history that most people probably don't know, because it's focusing on Elizabeth before her reign, which her reign is fodder for lots of historical fiction, and if you're not focusing on Elizabeth, you tend to be focusing on Henry VIII and his court. This is a different piece of that puzzle, as it were, and so that was interesting. But there were a few things that really did not sit right with me. So as I mentioned, the book starts when Elizabeth is 2 or 3 years old, and you follow her through a good chunk of her childhood, and the way that they have her speak and the way that they have her think is just not plausible in my opinion. Like, it was too mature and too precocious, and I know that it's all based on this one quote that Elizabeth apparently said when she was around that age, but it just felt weird and felt off to me. And then on top of that, I feel like, especially in the first half of the book, I do think this got better towards the second half, but in the first half of the book, the pacing felt a little bit weird, and I understand that part of that was because Alison Weir was really trying to capture the frenetic nature and the frenetic existence that Elizabeth would have had with her father marrying and divorcing, or marrying and beheading all of these wives during her childhood and adolescence, with her father dying, with her brother coming to the throne, with Lady Jane Grey being declared queen, then that whole thing going awry, then her sister Mary becoming queen, and then her ultimately becoming queen. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on, but at the beginning of the book, it felt a bit jarring, the experience of going through all of that, and I wish it had been done a little bit smoother. In addition to all of that, I do think that this is a book that the third-person narrator was a bit of a disservice to it. I think it would have been more compelling. I think I would have been more into the story if it had been told from a first-person perspective and had stayed with one character instead of kind of bouncing around between key players. It just didn't work for me in this book, and again made things feel a little bit jarring. And without giving any spoilers, there was a decision made with history that I did not approve of, and that definitely put me in a bit of a mood while reading this, suffice it to say. So I can't say much on that without giving spoilers, but yeah, decisions were made and I did not agree with them. So I ended up giving this 3 stars because I do think the history was interesting. I do think the second half of the book was much more compelling than the first half, but it wasn't something that I was necessarily super enthusiastic about. I don't want to say I would never read another Alison Weir fiction, but I feel like I would have to do some more research and figure out which ones have like better reviews or which ones people really, really love, because this one kind of makes me a little nervous to read the other books in her backlist, unfortunately, but I do love her nonfiction, so there is that. But yeah. And the last book is Cocaine Blues by Kerry Greenwood, which is the first book in the Phryne Fisher murder mystery series, and I am obsessed with the TV show and the movie. It is one of my comfort watches. Like, I've probably rewatched the 3 seasons of it like a dozen times or something like that. Like, whenever I don't know what I want to watch, I put that on, and I went into this being very excited. I also know that Rosie really loves the book and the series and actually had a whole video on why it's like a comfort or a cozy read, and so I really went into this with high expectations, and it was good. It was enjoyable. I ended up giving it a 3-star review because it is enjoyable. It captures a lot of the feelings, the warm and fuzzies, the excitement that I got from the TV show, but I do think that without having been as in love with the TV show, I probably would not have enjoyed this quite as much if I didn't have that going for me. So for me, Phryne is still phenomenal. She's lively and interesting and ultra like feminist in her views, especially in the 1920s. She is this flapper slash lady investigator or detective, and she ends up returning to her native Australia to help these well-to-do individuals who think that their daughter is being poisoned by her husband, and so she goes to solve that mystery, and while she's there she meets this whole cast of characters, and they get kind of sucked into these other 2 sort of mysteries that Phryne is also trying to solve and unravel at the same time as this original like poisoning plot. And it's really interesting, but I would say that like for a book that is not even 200 pages long, having these 3 storylines at the same time is a lot. Like, I probably could have done with 1 less, and also I would say that there is this fixation on Phryne's fashion, and she's someone who loves fashion and loves fast cars and loves sex and pretty men and all of that stuff, and you get a taste of it and sort of this hedonism that is very much flapper and 1920s, but I don't know if I necessarily needed so much focus on exactly the outfit she was wearing. Like, they described her clothes all the time, and as much as I love fashion, and 1920s fashion is spectacular, don't know that I needed it. Don't know. But yeah, it was a fun read, as I said. Like, this is nice and enjoyable and something that I could definitely see myself reading if I just want something that's fun, doesn't require a whole like lot of thinking or like contemplation. It's kind of like a cotton candy read for me, if I had to describe it. But it also wasn't my favorite in the world. I would potentially be interested in seeing if the characters are a little bit more developed as you read other books in the series, because as of right now, Jack Robinson has gotten very little time on the page, and I would be interested to see if they give him more time on the page, because he's one of my favorite characters in the TV show, and I know they tweaked things in the TV show with Jack and Phryne, but still, I'd be interested to see his character developed. I also don't know if I necessarily liked that both Cess and Bert, who are these 2 characters, communists is how they're described, cab drivers who end up helping Phryne and become part of her like found family. I didn't necessarily like that they really felt like the only 2 characters that had like a dialect or something going on, whereas like for the most part the other characters didn't, or if they did, it was used very sparingly, but with them there was a lot of sort of dialect going on, and it felt a little weird. Like, I understand it's part of their character, but I don't know if it was necessary to the extent that we have in this book. So yeah, enjoyable, a 3-star read. I would be interested to read more books in the series, but I wouldn't say that this would have made me love Phryne as much as the TV show. In this case, I would say that the TV show is better. Don't cancel me, Rosie, please. So yeah, those are the books that I read for April, 8 books in total, and it ended up being a pretty even split between hits and misses. 4 books 4 stars or higher, 4 books 3 stars or fewer, and that's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes. I'm okay with it. I still had a lot of fun participating in the 2 readathons, and I did find some really enjoyable books, so no regrets whatsoever. I do hope that you found some books to add to that ever-growing TBR of yours. If you did, be sure to let me know in the comments. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and be sure to give this video a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye!